Lisa says on Seinfeld, I should just now leave. A quick announcement, some of you may have come in late. I will sign for Kahari Brown's course, your attendance. Others of you are here for other classes. Your professors may be here taking note. And I want to thank my faculty colleagues for bringing all their students. That makes it much easier to have a packed house. Someone once said the best reason to give a brown bag at the Humanities Center is the introduction you get from Walter Edwards. And I think in his case, he's paid me back for the comments I made about him at the Humanities Center conference, because I really do believe in fact, I just told him a few minutes ago that if he did less, he might get more money from the university. He gets so very little, and I don't think there's a day that there's not some sort of brown bag. And I think that he is a gem in this university, bringing together scholars from a wide range of disciplines, building community. So for that, I thank him for both his introduction and his ongoing and dedicated effort towards scholarship.
He also feeds the poor.
He feeds the poor. One of the downsides of actually giving it paper is you can't eat the food he provides. I also want to just remind everybody, soon you'll be getting letters, or if you haven't, you should think about year-end gifts to the Humanities Center. It is money well spent. If you give it to the Humanities Center directly, then they actually get it. If you give it to Wayne State, who knows where it goes. Having said that, some of you may have seen or listened or heard my talk at the RE City Humanities Center Symposium. This talk is more speculative. It's part of an ongoing research project that began, and Walter's mentioned the 2 years that I was a fellow at the Institute. And I'm grappling with sort of a general question about what cities do in decline, and how do cities cope, and how do we deal with cities in decline. And we're just now, Detroit's going out of bankruptcy right now, and it's not unfair to say that they're really, at best, there'll be two Detroits. There'll be a small Detroit that is personified by Indian Village or Parma Woods or some of the developments along the Detroit River. And it's tied to all sorts of benefits and privileges that you get downtown. It has a high per capita income. And then there's the new development that Illich is trying to develop around the hockey arena. I just saw in yesterday's paper or today's paper that even though it's yet to be built, they've already arranged for a 2018 NCAA round in Detroit, a big boon. So there is activity in the city of Detroit, but it seems to be focused on people with higher incomes. And then there is the other 130 some odd square miles of the city of Detroit that is in various stages of either decimation, disrepair, or completely empty. And what I did at the presentation at the Humanities Symposium was I talked about some of the factors and forces that go into this. And this is a picture of a building many of you may have seen. If you go down, I think it's 375, you go by it, it's not far from the casinos. Clearly they're taking down a building, who knows what's going to go up there. But when I saw it, I stopped and took a picture because it seemed to me to be somewhat emblematic in that it represents a sort of a destruction, but it doesn't reflect the kind of rebuilding. And if you've spent time, for instance, in Germany, there's an area near Duisburg and Dusseldorf, which was it used to be a very heavy industrialized area, and they've repurposed a lot of the buildings. So for example, there's a really large oil containing building, like those drums you see as you drive down past towards Toledo. And what they've done is they've turned it into a diving school, and there are concerts there, and it's sort of a repurposing that doesn't destroy the history, but recognizes transformation, and we don't see that in Detroit. So the title of the talk is Limits to Social Sustainability, and the reason I sort of do that is the question is, what is social sustainability and why is it important? A paper I presented at these aforementioned monthly scholars conference, when it was done, Walter said to me, but what is social sustainability? And it's like, well, why be bothered answering that? But it's really an important question. And we think of sustainability, the three circles really represents the change in thinking There's environmental sustainability, and I would argue that almost all the research done is around environmental. So you see, you hear about green cities, you hear about automobiles, reducing pollution, people first. And then there is the economic, which is sort of, you want reinvestment, you want to be sustainable. And I'm part of an NSF grant that's at the engineering school where we're looking at what they call smart manufacturing, which is how do you build something that is economically sustainable. And in that project, I was shocked to find out that because of standards and because of technology, for example, when you have a wafer plant, the wafers that you make, not what you eat, but wafers that you make for computer boards and it has such high degree of precision that the water that they use to clean the boards has to be really pure. And it reaches a level where they can no longer use that water and they dump it. And when they dump it, they actually improve the quality of the local water table because it has fewer chemicals than you'd see naturally occurring. And that's, in some ways, an argument for environmental sustainability in the context of manufacturing sustainability. And then the social dimension is often talked about, but no one knows how to really measure it, no one knows how to articulate it. And as I'm going to go through in my talk today, I'm going to talk about how social sustainability really is not attainable because there's no imperative. And I'll explain what I mean by that. But what you see is the relative importance. So the whole Silent Springs of the 60s and 70s, the environmental movement, made environmental sustainability really important. And that was the time in which we were concerned about water being dumped. You have a shoe factory and you dump the water out into the local river, and then downriver there's a park and a beach, and the water comes down brown, you come out stained. Or, if you've been in Michigan long enough, you know that there's been various episodes of chemicals dumped by Dow Chemical. And so what we've had is a whole series of legislation that has required environmental protection in one form or another. And that environmental issue was really important all throughout the mid-80s into the early 90s. Now, one can make the case that the environmental imperative was sort of hurt by declining economy, and everyone said, well, if we have to have these standards, then we're going to not be able to have as many jobs. That's a debatable question, but you can see by the late 90s, the economic realm, the importance of job creation, all that kind of stuff becomes much more focused, and so there's a rebalancing, if you will, but the social remains somewhat absent. And what do I mean by social? Consider a plant, and let's say we have a neighborhood here in Detroit, and we decide we're going to get a plant that goes in there. And it's a pretty high-tech plant. It requires certain skilled labor. If you use the best technology, you're often going to require a workforce that has a higher level of skills. Often that means that the local population that's been unemployed and used to maybe work in the auto industry and has what I would say late technologies, lathe operators, machine shop workers, people who had good jobs, strong jobs in the 60s and 70s, who now with the decline of manufacturing, and I'm going to pause for a minute, it's not the decline of manufacturing per se, because we often don't pay attention. The auto industry still makes the same 14, 15 million cars a year, but it does so now with a quarter of the workforce. So it's not just the decline of manufacturing, it's the decline of manufacturing jobs through technological innovation, changes, etc. But let's say we build a plant, and the best technology that we can employ is profit maximizing. But what happens? Well, we get an influx of better skilled workers because the local population can't be hired. That raises the pressure on local rents or property values. That displaces the people that are there. And I can sort of draw this out to take a half hour, but at the end of the day, the community is displaced and a new community pops up. And all too often what we do is we measure points in time. So 1990, there was a low per capita income, a low property value, a low rent, all these measures that said the economy, the local economy was in the tank. And then 10 years later, we see a higher per capita income, higher rents, higher property values, and no one pays attention to the fact that you've replaced all the people who used to live there with people who now can get jobs at these new plants. And so the question becomes, where is the social sustainability? Again, I'll use Germany. For a long time, if a plant wanted to close, for example, you had to negotiate with the local community, the local union, local government. You had to identify and demonstrate where the consequences were, what were the alternatives. It wasn't just come to work on Friday and get a pink slip because the plant's closed on Monday. So there was a social requirement to how we made these decisions. the triple bottom line is this concept that says, is there a pointer here? Yeah, that's the sweet spot right in there, right? When you get into the middle of this little Venn diagram, that's the point at which we get everything that we want, both economic, social, and environmental sustainability. So, but most sustainability initiatives and the research being done focuses on things like environmental, oh, pardon me. I went to the trouble, I might as well hand them out.
Oh.
There are 4 slides per page, 1 on each side, there's 2 people behind you. I made 30 copies, you may have to share. So, you know, environmental sustainability, consumers and companies, what kind of, you know, what's the impact of sustainability on consumption? Going back again to the 80s and 70s, one of the arguments was, well, if we have to clean up the plants, it's going to raise the price of the product, it's going to hurt consumers. And the counterclaim was the people who want your product should have to pay. And one of the concepts was the notion of privatizing social costs. In other words, bring the cost of cleaning up, it should be internal to the production process. Now, why that matters is today, for instance, I was on a site visit in Massachusetts. Where was I? They all look the same. But it was a factory that was being built. North Carolina, sorry. Anyway, no? Yeah, North Carolina. And it was a factory that was being built, and what they were doing was they were sort of implementing environmental scrubbers to clean the air. But the concern was, I don't know what the numbers were. Let's say right now the standards are 5 parts per million in the air quality. It can't pollute more than that. Well, if you build the scrubber so that it can take it all the way down to 2 parts per million, you may be overbuilding, right? Maybe because of legislative changes, it'll go back up to 6 or 7, and so you have a more than adequate. So the balance is, how far do we think the environmental requirements will go so that we only produce, so we only implement something that'll take us down to, say, 3 parts per million, because that'll be a lot cheaper to build than it would be a factory that cleans out up to 1 part per million. Am I being too esoteric here? Huh? So the point being is that these are all linked. The environmental and the economic are linked in a way that I'll talk about in a few minutes. So you have concerns about supply chains and profits. You have concerns about community and investors, who's going to invest, international environment. But it's not clear from the United States perspective what social sustainability really is. So the questions I ask is it the precondition for sustainable development or the need to sustain specific structures and customs in communities and societies? Who are we serving in the social sustainable agenda, right? Who is to be addressed? One of the things that I hear a lot when I'm working out in the community about policy and decision making is, no one asks the homeless where low-income housing should be, right? The question is, who are we dealing with, and who is the community that we want to conserve? And in my little narrative before, clearly we were driving out people who couldn't live in that community, couldn't get the jobs, and as the quality of life, as the cost of living in the community rise, these people move on. I moved to Ann Arbor in 1975, I think it was. For those of you in school, I was in graduate school 9 years. Walter left out one of my master's degrees. It was either that or alcoholism, and I decided to stay in graduate school for 9 years. It's a lesson. It's a lesson for you. But the point is, my first house was in a part of Ann Arbor that had been historically black, retired auto workers in the north side of Ann Arbor. And what was happening was, slowly, because of all the influx and all the growth and the development and the sort of gentrification of Ann Arbor, property taxes kept going up so that these people had to sell because they didn't have the money to stay. And they moved to Ypsilanti, and they moved out towards Chelsea or wherever they can find cheaper property. And that's what I mean. Who are we trying to retain and protect? The 2010 census in Chicago was the first time that the average income inside Chicago exceeded the average income in the surrounding communities, partly because of displacement in neighborhoods. When I was living in Chicago teaching at Loyola, were nice neighborhoods to go to, whether it was in Logan Square in a Hispanic community or down, sort of around Hollywood, and it was a very, interesting Vietnamese community. And as gentrification takes root, these people are pushed out. Today, if you go to Harlem, which is, sort of the synonym of poverty, you can't buy an apartment in Harlem for under $500,000, and half the time they're in these, sort of old new construction where you can actually see the cinder blocks inside the apartment that you're in. Again, we're displacing people, moving them out. I think that there was a recent map in the New York Times that basically showed that I think there are only certain parts of Brooklyn and sections of the Bronx that still provide affordable housing for people because of the way the city is transforming. So the first question is, who are we building, who do we want to sustain? The second, is it the end point of, the finality of development, so that all our sustainability goals are to improve the physical space? And then finally, is it an end state or a socioeconomic process? In other words, really, what does community mean, and what does society mean? And are we going to end up, sort of reservation people, put them all in certain areas, etc. So I came up with a working definition just for the point of making sure Walter doesn't bother me at the end of the talk. But it's the objectives permitting individuals, communities, and societies to achieve development models that they have chosen for themselves, taking into account both the physical boundaries of their places and the people who occupy that space. In other words, if you think about Detroit, and you conceive of a model of Detroit resurrection, will it be one in which Detroiters today will find a place, or will it be one in which the transformation will become Detroit from Disneyland? One does not have to look very hard at the plans that Illich has for his stadium and the $200 million he's going to invest in several large area around the stadium. Those are housing built for young people in nice high-tech jobs. It's not housing that they would expect people to move into from Brightmoor or from other parts of Detroit. And secondly, there's all this talk about right-sizing that keeps coming up in various versions, which is we want to relocate people. On the cynical side, some people worry that it has to do with commercial farming and have urban spaces, but that's not the scope of what I'm talking about. But the point is that social sustainability, if it's meaningful, it's organic to the community in which we are sort of trying to see some changes, some positive changes. All right. So there are a variety of things. I have to remember to leave some time because I always think I have not enough to say, and I always go over, as David, he's not here, David Marola found out at the talk. I kept telling him, quiet, I'm not going to answer your time to stop. So I want to leave some time at the end for conversation and questions because this really is speculative for me. This is all part of a process that I'm undergoing right now. So social sustainability traditionally has these sort of key themes: basic needs, education, skills, equity, employment, human rights, poverty, social justice. The problem with all of those measures is that they're hard to identify and operationalize. I mean, we all think we know what equity means, but really what is equity, what is fairness, and how do we implement that? And some of the themes now are demographic changes, empowerment, participation, access. If you think about empowerment, participation, access, and then think about why it has to be mentioned in the stake of human rights, for example, it's because people are talking more and more about what do the people who are affected feel are their rights. I think last night's Daily Show did a special on the Detroit water debacle where I think there were 22,000 families were cut off from water. Israel would not cut off water to Gaza because they said that was inhumane and it was against human rights, and yet Detroit cuts off water to its poor, even though the golf courses and the large stadiums are also behind in their water bills. So the question of who, again, I keep coming back to who. Who is community? Who gets to decide? Identity, sense of place, culture, health and safety, social mixing, social capital, well-being. These are all emerging concepts because they begin to recognize that we have to think about the people in place and not just think about the place, all right? So I'm back to my Venn diagram, and I mentioned that before, and here's that sweet spot right in there. But I put a dashed line around the social sustainability because in my mind, it's not enforceable. What I mean by that is, and I'll go into it in a minute, well, I'll start right now. The economic and the environmental are driven by constraints, whether it's profit maximizing or environmental. So It's an unfortunate and misleading metaphor as far as I'm concerned, because it gives you the illusion that we're trying to meet all three dimensions at the same time, right? It promises the possibility of a solution to an intractable tension and contradiction between environment, economy, and society. In other words, it's not unreasonable to say that there's a social cost of meeting there's an economic cost of meeting environmental restraints. Granted, but we take that on. We, as a society, decide that, for instance, anyone who's seen a picture of Beijing, except for when there was a recent meeting where they banned all sorts of anything that produced smoke, and it looked blue sky for a day or two, right? And then once everybody goes back to normal, the city is like, it's encased in pollution. There's a cost, and so there's a tension in that cost. And a lot of the resolutions of that tension ends up becoming a product of power relations. Who has what control, what power? So ideally, the solution set represents a constrained exercise where production techniques, manufacturing design decisions are taken so that profits can be maximized, subject to environmental and social constraints. Now, for me, the problem is the second part of that last sentence. Subject to environmental, which we have laws, and social constraints for which we have no restrictions, we have no requirements, we have no guidelines. So if you build a plant and it's environmentally sound, but the result is that you hire, you end up hiring few workers in the area, or you take up a lot of eminent domain, displace a lot of people, so be it. There's no problem. So just from an exercise, sort of an operational exercise, and you don't have to get into the details, but basically economics, the economic constraint is profit maximizing. And profit maximizing, very simply, is the pie is profit is a function of labor, capital, and technology. And there's no concern for social context in any of these. If you think about it, labor is labor, which is a supply of workers, and if you can't get the right workers, you hire where you can, and you bring them in with incentives or whatever. Capital and technology are self-defining, but again, we have to pay attention. The technology is often referred to as sort of some deus ex machina. It just happens, but we make choices about which technologies to use. So back in my example about we're going to build a new factory and we're going to, instead of displacing workers, let's assume for a minute that we use second best technology. It's not the most economically efficient, and let's say as a government policy, I'll step ahead for a second, as social policy for social sustainability, we decide that anyone who hires local unemployed workers gets a tax break or a subsidy on their salary. So by using second best technology, you can hire locally, but you give up certain profits. But by giving you a tax break, you lower the cost of labor so that you meet your profit goals, assuming that we concern ourselves with profit goals. And the result is maybe we can hire locally. It's not the most economically efficient production, but it's a sufficient production, and the owners of capital get their return because there's a government subsidy, and we have a social benefit. But there's nothing social about these factors themselves. Labor, capital, and technology are what we get. Environmental standards, another sort of exercise, array of reflecting policy parameters. In other words, you can't produce smoke, you can't produce sound, you can't do whatever you have to do. An array of material resource choices. There's an awful lot of discussion about trying to get away from these, what they call heavy metals, because they are very polluting and very damaging. And so there's always this sort of search for better technologies that use different materials. An array of tolerance choices, and I'll give you an example. If any of you know Chicago, there's this wonderful island in the middle of one of the Chicago rivers that you may know better because it's named, a beer is named after it, which is Goose Island, right? So those of you that drink Goose Island beer have no idea where it comes from. But Goose Island is in the middle of Chicago. If you think about Chicago, there's a river that comes from the lake, and then it splits into North and South Branch. If you go up the North Branch, there's Goose Island. And that whole area along Clybourne was traditionally a heavy industrial area. And what happened was, in the 50s and 60s, a number of things happened such that it cost less to build a new plant outside the city than it did to resurrect or refurbish the plants inside the city, and the city kept losing manufacturing jobs. At some point, a lot of those buildings were turned into lofts. Part of the reason that they were turned into lofts is because it became absorbently expensive to live along the Gold Coast, which is Lake Michigan. But if you went to the old factory spaces, you'd find that you can put boat docks along the North Branch have these condos, and instead of paying for a parking space, you pay for a boat launch space. And so it became very fashionable to move up along the river, and the same thing happened with Printers Row moving along the South Branch. A problem exists. Industrial areas, when do they get their deliveries? Trucks come in late at night, the factory works 24 hours, railroads, if anyone ever been near a railroad siding, when the train comes in, couples, decouples, you hear the screeching, the clanging, the clashing. And so what was happening was, when you build residential, in other words, convert the factory to residential, there are noise pollution restrictions that make it impossible for factories to operate. Because usually, zoning laws are hierarchical, and the occupancy for tenants, whether it's renters or owners, has more restrictions than industrial use. And what that did was it put pressure on and threatened the industrial base of Chicago. And what happened in the late 80s and early 90s was they developed this notion of linked development, protected manufacturing districts, right? And what the protected manufacturing districts meant was, when you moved into a manufacturing district that converted an old factory into a condo, you recognized that you gave up some of your rights for instance, no noise at night, because the trucks would deliver so that the manufacturing could stay in the area. And at the end of the day, it worked out. Chicago retained its manufacturing. A lot of the abandoned buildings ended up getting converted, and so be it. So that's what I mean by tolerance choices, an array of tolerance choices. So public policy sets limits. The environmental mix depends on the materials you use, and the engineers, meaning people who develop these plants, make adjustments in order to meet all these requirements. Social sustainability is sort of human needs maximization, right? And how do you accomplish that? Well, it's, for lack of better terms, I just talk about tangible and intangible measures of social well-being, community development, and local economic growth. Now let me pause for a minute and parse the notion of development versus growth, right? An environmental scientist once commented that growth, the only thing for which growth is an end in itself is cancer. Everything else, development is not the same as growth. And we make the mistake in this country often of talking about growth and development as if they're interchangeable, right? And sometimes development means constraining growth or shaping growth, or conceding that not growing is not necessarily a bad thing. So there are two immediate problems as I try to deal with this. There's a measurement issue, and it's unclear what objectives we want to go after, and I'm still not clear. And the absence of policy imperatives or constraints. What do I mean by that? Well, we know if we don't meet the environmental standards, we will get fined, or we will not even get a permit to operate. Just like when you build new housing, you have to go through a housing inspector, and if you don't get a certificate of occupancy, you can't rent it out, so you care about that stuff. No policy imperatives. We don't have an agenda in this country that says community matters, sustainability matters. We hope it works out, but time and again, study after study, you will find that often the community suffers even though the measures in the community improve, as I described earlier. So, excuse me for a second. The iPhone, if you don't address it, will just keep bothering you. And it's even worse, a family member. All right, so in an ideal world, the intersection represents the center of our triple bottom line, which would be the constraint maximization sweet spot I talked about. And we would be able to maximize all these, we get profit maximization, but we'd be doing it in the context of both environmental and social sustainability. But without any ability to impose social sustainability, we can't achieve that with any certainty. We can't direct the outcomes, we can't sort of measure those outcomes, and we can't expect it. So in other words, it works by accident, it doesn't work on purpose. And my sister is pressing me here. If you ignore this circle, because it no longer reflects a real constraint, then what you will get is this area in here, which is the outcome because it reflects the combination of economic and environmental constraints. And if you appear in this little triangle, it's by accident. In other words, it's not impossible for good to come out of these decisions. It can happen, right? Somebody can build a plant and it serves the community. We see that over and over again. The question isn't whether it can happen. The question is whether we have any kind of mechanism to ensure that it happens. And so I would argue that we always satisfy this area of intersecting environmental and economic constraints, but we hardly satisfy the third component of it, which is social sustainability. All right, so I conclude there's no necessarily sustainable solution in the way we structure things. Now, I'm not going to go into other countries, Scotland, I'm thinking of Australia, Germany to some extent. There are countries in the Western world, and I'm focusing on Western world because this is an industrial process, because as my colleague has reminded me that when we talk about other countries like India and China, we may see different agglomerations and social forces at work, and so she's chastised me once. I can't afford to have it happen again. So, but it's certainly a Western European concern, where, especially if you're thinking about the advanced capitalist societies going through transition. And if you look at Europe right now, for example, the US has been going through these urban concerns and praxisms for 40 or 50 years now. Europe is just now entering that same kind of problem with migration, with, and so it's not race in a traditional sense post-slavery, but it's race in the sense of Turkish or Greek immigrants or North African immigrants into France or wherever. So their cities are starting to deal with the same kind of issues of space, region, containment, who is the community, and in whose benefit do we do things. So, searching for indicators, we have these sort of traditional indicators which are usually static, and by static I mean point-in-time indicators. How were things in 1980? How are they in 1990? How are they in 2010? And we try to extrapolate, right? One of the things that urban sociologists are often looking at, or urbanists in general, is they're concerned about whether neighborhoods are changing or they're stable. And that sort of gives you a notion that if they're in transformation, usually we see stable neighborhoods as a plus and unstable neighborhoods as potentially a problem. Usually we think of it as a problem if unstable neighborhoods mean they're going from more to less prosperity. But stable neighborhoods could also mean they were poor to start with and they're poor today, right? They end up being stable on whatever metric. So these static comparisons don't give us a dynamic sense of what's going on. Quantitative, there's an old adage that the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem's a nail. Or alternatively, if you only have a two-story ladder, you can only get into the second story of a building. Quantitative measures require that you can measure them, right? You can measure income per capita. You can't measure the social benefit of, so for example, a project I did in Chicago was whether or not do we close there was a little triangle park, and what I mean by that was there were 3 streets that came together and there was a little park in that area. And it turned out that the goal was, let's turn that park into a little commercial strip mall, because it would provide benefits to the community, because you can measure those. But what wasn't measured, and what ended up being part of the analysis, was it turned out that that park was a meeting place for informal information about jobs that were maybe 1 week, 2 weeks, 4 weeks, under the radar, but it was a community job bank through just gathering there. And once that gets factored in, it's not really empirically easy to do, but it becomes part of the discussion about what matters to the community. Descriptive, monodimensional, target-oriented, top-down selection. Top-down is very important, right? One of the things that any community activist is always struggling with is, I want to get into the meeting, right? I want to be part of the discussion. I want to represent a constituency that is disregarded for the most part. I made that comment before about the homeless never asked about where to build low-income housing. We can do the same thing with the hungry, with the poor. What kind of services do we need? Somehow or other, that's all done by people who think they understand what the problems are, and they mean well. I'm not going to make any sort of assumption about people's intent, but there's that old saying that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And if you don't get the people who are affected by by what's going on, you're not sure that the solution reflects their real needs. Because often it turns out that you don't see the needs. For instance, a lot of work is being done now that one of the biggest impediments to getting jobs by low-wage workers, especially single parents, is not the skill sets or finding jobs, it's childcare. You know, how do you go to work and leave your child alone? And I used to have a child. I still have a child. My child's in college. So when I say used to, I mean he doesn't think he has a parent anymore. But the point being, when he was young, I remember being in shock. You know, you want to go out, you get a babysitter, you go out to dinner, you go to a movie, and suddenly it becomes a $200 evening. Like, when did that happen, right? And so you go home instead, and you force the kid to go to bed early, and you watch TV, and you're unhappy about everything. And which is maybe why he thinks he doesn't have parents anymore. So what's emerging are these notion of intergenerational with some uncertainty. For example, if you look at the auto industry, and you look at the history of workers in the auto industry, starting in the 30s and 40s and moving on, every immigrant group that came into Detroit and got jobs in the automobile industry, invariably a large proportion of their own children ended up getting jobs in auto. You know, as they got older, they got jobs that had lots of overtime. And in a very Weberian sense, it didn't matter if you were a small shopkeeper or a worker with 60 hours of overtime. You lived in a nice neighborhood, you probably had a boat in the garage, and you probably had a cabin up north where you went to. And their kids would find jobs in the same workplace. So whether it's Italian immigrants or Irish immigrants or what have you. By the 70s, the auto industry is finally integrating. But by 1990, the most junior person in the auto plants tended to have 25 years of seniority because they didn't hire more people. And if the last group coming in, for instance, African Americans who are now getting jobs, their children did not have an opportunity. So there's a whole lost intergenerational transition that is gone for a whole group of people in Detroit, for example. So this notion of, and again, you know, you have to be sort of not conscious of the news. There's always something about this next generation is not going to live as long because they're obese, or this next generation is not going to be as wealthy as their parents. You know, up until now, every generation assumed they'll do as well or better than their parents. Now students are just happy to survive. So intergenerational concerns, hybrid, meaning that sometimes a single problem isn't only that problem. You have to start, you know, in sociology we talk about, what's the word I'm looking for, intersectionality. In other words, there are lots of things happening at the same time. If you only focus on gender, you miss other things. If you only focus on race, you miss other things. And so there's a tendency to look, and so you want to bring things together. Process is that thing that is not static, right? When you look at point A and point B and you look at those numbers, you don't understand how the change occurred. You don't understand why the change occurred. Is it a positive change? Is it a negative change? You only see the results strategic, multidimensional. I'm not going to go through each one of these things. The main thing is deliberative and reiterative selection, meaning you talk about options, you consider those options, and you go back and talk about them some more. And it's an iteration, one after another, as you try to come up with a solution. It's not top-down, it's bottom-up. So where does this leave us? And I'm at the end. It gives us about 15 minutes to talk about this. Communities struggle to distinguish between development and growth. All right? This is very important. It's important for political reasons as well as social reasons. If you think about it, when there's an investment decision to be made and your re-election cycle is 2 years, you care more that you brought a Church's Fried Chicken into the neighborhood and brought 5 more jobs, and you don't care at all about the fact that none of those 5 jobs will sustain somebody for, you know, in terms of a family. Because what you do is you go up before the press and say, I'm a job creator. I brought jobs into the community. And that's true locally, statewide, nationally. A focus on jobs is a focus on growth. It's not focused on development. What kind of jobs, right? Especially in terms of time frame. Long-term planning is very different than short-term planning. If the election cycle is 2 years, you only care about what you can see in 18 months because that's what you're going to campaign on, right? Policymakers, and there's a lot of tension on the very local level. Municipalities are constantly struggling whether they want a strong mayor and city council, which are elected, or they want a strong city manager and a professional staff. And again, for those sociology students, it's a basically Weberian question. Is it democracy or bureaucracy, right? Because the idea that bureaucracies, if they run right, can afford to take time, can afford to take the long view, right? This morning, Walter mentioned court. I was down at the U.S. District Court hoping to not be sworn into a jury, and I managed to get out. There was a person, am I moving out of frame? There was a person sitting there, and he was talking about, see, I lost my train of thought.
Court.
No, before that.
Very.
Oh, long-term and short-term? Oh, I know what we're talking about. He was looking forward to the mass transit system.
Yes.
And he wanted to go out to 8 Mile. He thought he would go out to 8 Mile, and he lived up near 8 Mile, and he'd take instead of having to drive his car or wait forever on the bus stop, he'd take the train. And I looked at him and I said, it's only going to Grand Boulevard, as far as I understand it. And and then another guy chimed in and said, yeah, it's only going to be built for the stadium. And I'm thinking, what does that mean for the stadium? Because who's building housing near Grand Boulevard that's going to house all these people that are going to go down to the stadium? So this is growth and development. People are going to point to this M1 rail line that's going to be just about a scintilla more intelligent than the people mover, right? Which is a national joke, because every time they want to talk about mass transit in a city, there's always a little film of the people mover that goes around in a circle, and I feel like I'm playing with my son's little electric set. It just goes around and around, and I don't think I've ever seen a picture with more than 2 or 3 people on the people mover. And I've even been tempted to take it, and I didn't understand why and where would it take me.
In a circle.
In a circle. Well, I'm already going around circles, so I didn't need to. Needs of the locality is a politically contested idea, all right? We see this over and over and over again. In whose interest? And let's talk about Detroit. Many of the problems Detroit faces, one can point to the tension between the city itself and the surrounding counties. And a lot of the policies that affect Detroit and the whole area come out of SEMCOG. And about a year or two ago, there was a New Yorker article that sort of looked at L. Brooks Patterson, who's the county executive in Oakland, and the title of the article is Drop Dead Detroit. In other words, regionalism doesn't always mean localism. And these political issues, setting aside race, just setting it aside for the moment, how and who pays for what kind of development is very important. And Oakland being one of the richest counties in the area, and Detroit, certainly Detroit, and even Wayne County, struggling, this notion of locality becomes important. One of our graduate students did his master's thesis, I forget with whom, was, what does it mean to be a Detroiter? Because, you live in Troy or Rochester Hills or wherever, and anywhere you go, where are you from Detroit? Because who knows what Troy is? You don't come from Greece, or wherever that is, right? Just like someone once told me that, you ask students where Toronto is, and half of them listen to it and say, oh, that must be in Italy, right? Everyone identifies as they're from Detroit, but so few people are from Detroit. And so what does it mean politically in locality? And then the solutions in the U.S. are hampered by the absence of a legislative and a legislative imperative in market operations. And if you heard my talk at the symposium, one of the things I was trying to do there was to argue what would a city look like if it organized itself out of market. Not that you don't have to deal with markets in some large way, because we are a market economy, capitalism rules. But can we do things that take away those fluctuations? Would Detroit have been a better place if some of the investment decisions were not based on rate of return and where do I get, sort of what kind of capital, or do I want to close this down and produce in Brazil, or produce in Mexico, or produce in India or China? But rather, the city has an investment, the city owns. I told a story when I was giving that talk, for those of you that were there, I'm sorry if this is repetitive, but when I was visiting Hamburg back around 1995, 96, they were subsidizing the wages of the shipbuilders so that the shipbuilding companies would stay open longer with the hope that the economy would turn around. And when I asked the mayor why they did that, because coming from the States, that's like not even legal, the mayor said to me, well, if you think about the unemployment costs, the family breakdown, the truancy, the fall in property values, the loss of tax revenues, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, it far outweighs the social cost of simply subsidizing the workers for a while so that the plant stays in operation, right? And on top of that, they're also paying taxes because they're getting their taxes and it goes back. I'm reminded of Sweden. the way we deal with welfare in this country is you're stigmatized. You get a card, you have to know you're on welfare, you get a check. You know, we keep talking about, you know, go get a job, you're a deadbeat, even though no one pays attention. Something like between 70 and 80% of all people on welfare in this country work full time, so it's not a question of where they get a job. In Sweden, if you need welfare, there's always some place that will hire someone like you, so in return for the fact that you get a job, for instance, maybe you could be a teacher's aide and there's no need for you here, instead of getting welfare, they'll say, well, you know what, you can go up to Upper Michigan, the Upper Peninsula, there's a job there, we will pay the community to hire you as whatever you can do. You work up there until you have enough skills or you can find a job back down here. And while you're working up there, no one knows that you're getting your salary from the state. You're just another contributor to the community. You're paying taxes. You're part of the community. There's no stigma. And then as soon as you can find a job back in Detroit, you leave Upper Peninsula as fast as you can. Right? In this case, all of Sweden is like the Upper Peninsula except for Stockholm. That's another story. The point is that we have social policies or we don't have social policies, and they are as much impediments as solutions. And I will stop there, leaves about 10 minutes for questions. But so for me, this issue, no, Mike, I'm not going to call you first. So the issue for me is, I don't know where to take this. I'm trying to come up with a solution. Jose promised me this was not an editorial departure, but an important departure. All right, so I will open up. Go ahead, Andrew.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. It was really great to see the way you were systematizing your thinking about a subject that you've been thinking about a lot. One thing that I guess I have two questions. One is, in a lot of, you touched kind of indirectly, you kept talking about something, but never said this word, which is governance. And I was wondering how you might want, if you wanted to add that to your kind of schema, and if so, if not, why not? You know, and I was wondering where that kind of thought, because you talked, or maybe am I missing it somewhere?
Well, part of it is this, empowerment, participation, and access.
Because you, in a lot of ways, you mentioned, it's not that you don't mention the idea, like, in fact, so much of it is about governance, but the term itself and the language of governance doesn't get mentioned, and I was wondering about that.
Because, as an old former anarchist who grew up with don't vote, it only encourages them, my personal feeling is the real game is locally.
True.
And so governance becomes a distraction the way it's defined. So I'd rather talk about participation, I'd rather talk about democratic actions, I'd rather talk about, you know, movement from the bottom up. For instance, there's an awful lot of literature now on human rights as defined from the bottom internationally, as opposed to this legalistic, UN imposition. So the tension, I appreciate what you're saying, and you're right. There's, you know, I'm not ignorant of this, but I don't think, without getting into a long, drawn-out explanation about who runs the country and who makes, I don't think that we're going to see a lot of. It took a lot to get environmental protections in, and they erode very quickly. And I think that given the mood, at least in this country, where we're much more punitive, I don't see a lot of faith in the notion that we're going to pass legislation that concerns itself with the social content and consequences of those actions. So governance is, maybe it should be introduced early on and pushed aside, and rather for me it's participation, it's process, it's democratic.
I agree.
With a small d.
Yeah. I would just suggest that maybe that too is a different type of vision of what governance is. If you think of governance as something that doesn't always involve the government as the institution that.
And then it takes me to poli-sci, and I disdain poli-sci.
Yeah. So I just think it might.
No, it's a good point. And your second question?
More of a comment about how the social. I mean, there's a couple of clear reasons why social sustainability is the last one to sort of, or the missing one, but you know. It does seem that sustainability is kind of very much the language of power at times, because if you look at who's embraced that language, and it seems to be very entrenched. And this is actually another governance question now that I think about it. If you go above the level of like the U.S. government, and you look at the fact that some of those who embrace the language of sustainability the most are like the UN, you know, with like Agenda 21 and stuff like that. Do you see any promising routes by jumping a level up, sort of like with the Detroit water shutoffs, where the UN was able to weigh in on that?
And that affect the outcome.
Right, so maybe that suggests an answer to my question.
My thinking on that is that when you look at that level, it really quickly digresses to environmentalism. And I'm not saying that that's not important,
Yeah.
but when I did a scan of urban sustainability, I think if I found one article on social sustainability, I found 50 articles on green manufacturing, get the cars out of downtown, improving, all that kind of stuff. So I think, for me, you can't get away from social sustainability. It's almost on any NSF grant proposal. The description is, how do you deal with it? So I'm involved in a second NSF grant while I was in North Carolina that is more of the social scientists looking at social sustainability. And one of the things that I've raised when I've gone to several meetings of the group is it always digresses to environmentalism for the most part, because it's low-hanging fruit. And you want to get something and you want to feel like you're finding something. It doesn't mean we should stop looking. But, so my answer to you there is that I'm not sure going up, you lose the locality. And I think it all, at the end of the day, all politics is local. And that's sort of a problem. Michael, go ahead.
Just briefly, I wanted to mention, a lot of us have been working on community benefits agreements and looking at how different parts of the country have either grassroots organizing or through CDCs and like a more kind of formalized route of trying to inject the community sort of conversation into these big development works. And I think, as you mentioned, the Illegeville is a really big missed opportunity of getting a really strong kind of model for a community benefits agreement of, say, if you're going to get this land for $1 or whatever it was, you have to give us such and such kind of job pipeline or training or something like that. But with the mayor's office and the hostility that we've had towards the poorer residents of the city, with the county hostility, with the foreclosures that are going on, with whatever it is, like 1/5 of the population getting foreclosed on next year, and then with the situation with the police and the justice system, and the investigation with the FBI, it's really hard to see how, in this kind of environment, that there's really much room for us to have a meaningful sort of conversation about it.
I'll answer that two ways. I didn't hear a question, but I'll impute a question.
Yeah.
The first is, Ted Pride, one of my
of course.
students. One of the questions he's asking is, why do people participate in community development efforts when the efforts don't seem to benefit them? And it's an interesting dissertation that he's really working on, and I think he'll do some very interesting work, and he's struggling with that kind of question, which then leads me to the second part of my answer to your implied question, is who are these community development organizations and who they really represent? And one of the problems are that some may be organic to the community and some are I won't call them carpetbaggers, but they're organizations that are working towards community development, and they're almost as interested in being at the table with the governor's office or with the mayor's office as they are, dealing with the community itself. And that's a tension.
Yeah.
So the final little caveat to the very end of what you said is, there is this adage that if you don't struggle for it, if it's given to you, it's not what you need. No one concedes. Workers go on strike because they're not getting what they need, and they win through opposition. I think communities, the water is a perfect example. The kind of community action and the public, sort of shaming, if you will, of city government and the water and the UN stepping in did a lot to publicize what was going on. On the other hand, it didn't really, aside from FENA bringing truckloads of bottled water, it didn't really solve any issues. And so it's an ongoing struggle. And that's all I would say to anyone working. When I was an undergraduate, someone once said to me, you won't win until you win the last battle, and you have to just keep struggling. And I guess I would say, hold people accountable. Matt.
One comment, and then I have a question. I think as far as the city of Detroit goes, I don't think much will change until they actually get a viable transportation, because right now, if you're a family, you're coming up in the city of Detroit, you already have rent over your head, and then you have a car loan, and then we have like one of the highest insurance rates in the nation, so that's gonna always keep you where you are. And in addition to that, you don't have obtainable good education. Like, for example, the city of Grosse Pointe is one of the last few cities to where there is no open enrollment. Like, if you stay But between Grosse Pointe and Detroit, it's right there. So if you stay right on the other side of one street, but you wanted to send your child to that school, Alter Road, that's impossible. I guess my question is, do you have any cities that you know of that properly mix incomes and people income from people of different backgrounds? Because it seems like across the United States, the poor stay all together and more affluent people stay all together. There's no mixture.
That, George Galser in the Geography and Urban Planning Program, or it's now called just Urban Planning, does a lot of work on mixed income housing, and that may be a person you might want to contact who may know more. What comes to mind for me is someplace like Southfield, which in the 50s and 60s might have been predominantly Jewish and Italian, and now is predominantly African American. But I remember maybe 4 or 5 years ago, there was a millage on the ballot, and the community sort of at first didn't pass it, and then they did to sustain the educational system. And I think that as a city, as an area in transition, I think that offers a lot of possibilities. The reality is, and this is not going to digress into a lecture on race, but there's an awful lot of literature that just demonstrates that there are comfort levels that people move into economic areas where they are culturally comfortable. So if you're Chaldean, you want to be in a Chaldean community. If you're Yemeni, you go down to Dearborn. If you're African American and you're affluent, you find a community like that. And then you also move into your economic areas. And the problem with these mixed communities in terms of pure economics often comes down to zoning. Some of the more wealthier communities, I know outside of Chicago, they have minimum 2-acre zoning. So you can't afford to build a house because you can't afford to buy 2 acres. Whereas, you go to Pleasant Ridge or you go around the city, it's 1/4 acre. And so there are lots of little, hidden barriers that divide us economically. And I think once we're divided economically, people who are wealthy will look for people who are like them. So you go to Atlanta and you have some very wealthy and very prosperous African American communities. It's not like just because you're African American that you're going to be poor, but they are, they're not as integrated as you might like for a variety of reasons that are not necessarily racist, but they are, we live in a society that's very much divided, and I don't think we get away with that. I mean, we get away from that easily.
Thank you. I had a question regarding my understanding of the comment that the social section wasn't as defined as the environment, as the economics. There wasn't no guidelines as much. There wasn't as much constraints. It was hard to kind of quantify. Explain to me why you would not use perhaps egalitarianism, utilitarianism, liberty, Judeo-Christianity as maybe a guidance?
I think you misunderstood, or I misspoke, which is, no, it could be both. And that is, what I'm saying is, because of certain requirements of profit maximization, the economic realm takes care of itself. Because of legislative requirements, the environmental realm drives solutions that are consistent. Because we have no social sustainability requirements, they become self-defining and transformative. So yes, you can have moralistic communities that, I'm sure you'll find communities all over this country that may be religious-based or morally based, where they feed the poor, they practice their religion. But for the most part, that's in that little realm when I showed you that triangle. It can happen, but there's no guarantee that it will happen. And that's my point. In other words, without without making this a solid circle, there's nothing that says you're going to end up in that little sweet spot. And that's all I was trying to say. So we can come up with lots of different things that are socially sustainable, but getting action on it,
Give us an example of something that you would think, thinking in the right direction, of something that is sustainable.
Well, let's just say that we pass a law that says anyone that hires locally unemployed workers gets a tax break and a subsidy for their salary, so if my concern is I'm not profitable enough and the government gives me a tax break so that it raises my return on investment, I'm now as profitable as the most high-tech plant, and yet instead of hiring workers who I bring in from the outside and displace everybody, I'm hiring people that are existing in the community, which then increases economic activity in the community, people shop locally, families keep their homes. So that would be an example of a policy in my mind that would benefit locally. But we have this philosophy in this country that says you can't mess around with the market, and the government gets involved, and it's an unfair competition, whatever that means. So we give subsidies to the sugar industry that's poisoning our children, but we don't give but we complain about food stamps. I mean, the food stamps, not to get me started, but we're saving $8.5 billion on food to the poor over the next 10 years because of the recently signed legislation. By every estimate, Halloween candy sales over the next 10 years will be $25.8 billion. So people are, I mean, that's sort of the modern version of let them eat cake. Maybe we should require all poor people who need food assistance to show that they went trick-or-treating, because then they're going to get enough nutrients, apparently. So we'll spend 3.5 times on candy, but we begrudge people food stamp assistance. So that's what I mean by the social environment.
So there's no social considerations.
There's no imperative. It's not part of our public dialogue. We beat our chests, poor people. We're more apt to victimize and blame poor people than we are to recognize that there are constraints. So people are poor because they're lazy. People are, I mean, we still argue over whether food stamps should be allowed to buy alcohol, because if we allow it, then they're going to all go out and get drunk, and no one's going to care about feeding their children. Okay. Any other questions, or yeah?
So how do you, in your models and in what you're thinking about, how do we approach that problem? How do we, where do the idea of values and how we come to have certain values, how do we challenge those values? Is there a place for that in this whole discussion? Because we talk about social sustainability, but for some sectors of the community, there is no, their lives are becoming more and more unsustainable.
I think discussions, conversations, and sort of, I hate to fall back, but the notion of popular education, letting people understand, see. I mean, for example, one of the things that is starting to happen is a recognition that most poor people in this country actually are white, and that most rural people are poor, and we've become increasingly an urban society. And so as we move away from poverty as an issue of race and recognize that poverty is an issue of circumstance, it's easy to pretend that this is a problem of them and their problem, and recognizing that poor people are all over. I mean, there was that Other America written in 1962, was it? And suddenly we all discovered, oh my God, we're still the richest country in the world, and we rank, at the very bottom.
Second,
Huh?
I think China outpaced us last time.
Well, that's the total size of the economy, but I mean, it doesn't, whether we're first, second, or fifth, the reality, I saw recently that 1/10 of 1% of the top earners in the world have more than the bottom 9 billion, right? So we talk about resource equity, we talk about, a friend of mine in Japan does studies on homelessness. And he interviews the homeless in Japan, he interviews the homeless in the US. He says the narrative in the US consistently is, I, the homeless person, made a mistake. I made bad choices, I drank too much, it's I, personal failure. The narrative in Japan of the homeless, you go out, and if you go to Japan, you go to like the equivalent of Central Park in Tokyo, I have photographs of like these blue tent cities where the homeless live. You talk to them, and their narrative is society let us down. Society failed in their obligation to us, right? A lot of European societies have this notion that citizenship is an obligation of the state to the citizen, as opposed to in this country, citizenship is an obligation of you to the state, and if you don't meet that obligation, we have no responsibility. So that's the conversation. I don't think any particular thing will change it, but one thing after another is where we need to go. Yes, sir?
Me?
No, you know, sir. Even I can't get that
Sarah,
confused.
sir.
There's a sir next to you.
I just saw in the news this morning that Dan Gilbert bought the Compuware building.
Right.
And he's got like a collection of buildings he's getting. I mean, it's
He
like
owns about a third of the
we have
city,
a
I
little
think.
collection here, and it got me to thinking about how wealth and power is really shaping a lot of what's going on, not only as you in your initial remarks talked about it, but how it's shaping the dialogue that's taking place. And I wonder if you talk about sustainability, or social sustainability as you were bringing up, then how, I mean, that isn't even getting into the public discussion other than oh, Dan Miller bought another wonderful building
I
today.
have two words for you. Koch brothers. I mean, there is no secret. It's almost, no one's ashamed. They're buying elections, they're buying results. APEC, I think that's the name of their organization, is writing legislation for local governments and state governments. ALEC, thank you. So, I mean, they're really, you know, I would argue politically that the right won because they recognize that the struggles politically are at the local level, and they won state houses, and they won, you know, governorships, and they won legislatures, and they passed zoning ordinances, and they passed, you know, voting districts, and now I think somewhere it's like 10 seats in the House is up for grabs, and the rest are preordained. And we were all, you know, so we were all asleep. So, you know, the answer is, again, local action, discussion, and limiting our expectations, but not limiting our goals. Sarah, you wanted to?
Yeah, I have a comment that doesn't need an answer, but I just,
You're dreaming.
I just, there's a cup, sorry, let me think of how to explain it. Your definitions in the beginning of sustainability, I felt like you glossed them over in terms of economic and environmental and economic, because environmental, I'm pretty clear on, maybe because of its rising prominence, but economic, I think, is much more controversial and unclear when we talk about economic sustainability. And at least in your presentation, I didn't see a clear definition put there. And based on those definitions, I'd also encourage you, while this might be a definition that suits us for the purpose of keeping Dr. Edwards off your back today, I feel like it really needs it hasn't been hashed out. It could use more clarity, and in the sense that here it feels like you're encompassing these issues about power and the definition itself of social sustainability. When you encompass all of that, becomes a lot more than social sustainability. And so I feel like there's still a lot of other things that are getting wrapped up in that definition. And so,
Let me both agree with you and also make a comment.
Yeah.
And the response I would give you is that the difference between economic sustainability, as it's defined, is a market-based neoliberal concept. And that doesn't need further clarification. For me, the social sustainability has economic consequences. And so I don't want to confuse the market-driven rationale. I would argue, I have another paper I'm working on where I argue that the reason we're all interested in Polanyi today, or many people are, is because there's an attempt at sort of making the market legitimate, and that the market will correct itself, because neoliberalism is all about asserting the market as the final and only arbiter, and it's the only way to rationally and reasonably allocate resources when disregarding all the social consequences. And so one has to step away from all that. So when you say there's an economic component to sustainability, maybe, you know, yes, maybe for clarity in a larger piece, talking about economic sustainability is restricted to the pure market logic of profit maximization. But if we take profit maximization out of the equation, as I did by introducing, for instance, a subsidy hiring locally, you alter the market equation, because you allow, for instance, local governments or localities to participate where legally we're not allowed to now. And so, yes, I agreed. You know, I will wait for your talk to find out how you gloss over certain things.
Oh,
No,
I know.
it's a fair observation.
And I'm not suggesting you glossed over. I'm just suggesting that.
No, I did. I cut some short. You know, I made some shortcuts here, but
Right.
but for me, economic sustainability is really traditional market force economic rationality, and nothing more.
Well, that's growth, not sustainability, though.
No, it's neither. Well, it's the economic circle has nothing to do with sustainability. It's sort of sustainability. It's economic sustainability. If I make a rate of return, it's a sustainable investment. It has nothing to do with the community in which all that's happening.
Perhaps you could just add, like, maybe efficiency or per.
No, then it would concede to her, and I won't do anything. I think, Walter, how long do we go?
We are over time.
Because,
take one last question.
any more last questions? Anyone want to, do I have a question back there? I want to thank you all, by the way, for being engaged. And those four students that needed me to sign something and were forced to stay at the end, God bless, for